Hi there. Sorry I left you hanging yesterday. Wednesday night was a fun night because we went out for Julia to celebrate my daughter Julia getting inducted into the National Honor Society. Made it very hard to get the show done on Thursday, and I just bagged it. But here I am. Thanks to everybody who joined us at the Hangout. I think there's about 60 people there last night. We did almost 3 hours. Final hour was a lot of fun. You guys stay for the final hour or just come in for the final hour if you want to have fun, because that's when we usually get a little drinky and a little goofy. And we had a lot of laughs last night. So thanks to everybody who came to the Hangout. If you want to watch it, there's a link in the show notes to the email for all subscribers. You get access to the Hangout after it's over. One of the many benefits of being a stand-up subscriber. And we also solidified at the Hangout that there will be all 4 members of The Hue joining us in Las Vegas and taping a special conversation in person out there for PODJAM. So get your tickets right now. Tickets are in the show links to our 2nd annual gathering in Las Vegas. PODJAM 2, everybody. JL Cauvin, Tim Wise, Aaron Carroll, Eric Segall, Christian Finnegan, Ophira Eisenberg, Maura, Quint, and The Hue, the ladies of The Hue. Did I say everybody's name? I think I did. All right. Well, I have a great guest and conversation today. It's the author of The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, and The Good News Club, her first book, which covered the religious right's effort to infiltrate and undermine public education. She's got a new book out, and that's what we talk about today. It's called Money, Lies, and God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. It's getting a lot of attention, as it should, because of the topic, and even more importantly, because of the author. Investigative journalist and author Katherine Stewart joins me today. It is a real important book and quite a page turner. It's very compelling. I gotta tell you, this is a book that you should get and you should read and learn all about. Early reviews are in. Congressman Jamie Raskin says it's an indispensable citizen's guide to the anti-democratic MAGA right in America. Author Kristen Kobes-Dumez writes, meticulously researched, elegantly written, and hard-hitting. Why have so many Americans turned against democracy? In this deeply reported book, Katherine Stewart takes us to conferences of conspiracy mongers. She actually goes into all these conferences that you've read about and heard about at the news, and some you haven't. She goes into backroom strategy gatherings and services at extremist churches and profiles the people who want to tear it all down. She introduces us to reactionary Catholic activists, atheist billionaires, pseudo-Platonist intellectuals, self-appointed apostles of Jesus, disciples of Ayn Rand, women-hating opponents of the gynocracy, pronatalists preoccupied with the dearth of white babies, COVID truthers, militia members masquerading as concerned moms, and battalions of spirit warriors who appear to be inventing a new style of religion, even as they set about attacking democracy at its foundations. It is such a compelling analysis of the authoritarian reaction we're having in this country. And Katherine Stewart does such a good job writing this book and reporting it out. And I love talking to her. This is, I think, my 3rd or 4th interview with Katherine. Earlier this week, I talked to Sarah Posner. So clearly this is an issue that I think is of prime importance and concern. We've only seen this movement grow over the past 10, 20 years on this show and in our lives. So I'm skipping the news and headlines and everything for the second time. Well, I didn't do the show yesterday, rather, so I apologize for not bringing that to you today. But it is Friday, and we had the Hangout and excuses galore. I just wanted to bring you my conversation with Katherine Stewart. And remember, I cannot do any of it without you. So support the show at patreon.com/Pete Dominic right now. But let's get to Katherine, because this is a great conversation that I'm real happy with. Here we go. You did it! Katherine, congratulations. What an unbelievable amount of work this was. I know just a little bit of what goes into it. It was brave, it's smart, and it's super important. And I want to congratulate you on this very important book. And I'm so happy you're here to talk about it.
Thank you so much. But, I was really hoping that when this book came out, people would think it was irrelevant. They'd say, what are you talking about? Trump lost the election. We're righting the ship. And unfortunately, that's just not where we're at today.
Yeah, I was talking to your friend and, I guess colleague in your lane covering some of the similar issues, Sarah Posner, who I think you credit in your book. And I said to her the same thing I'd say to you, the reverse is like, I was hoping your work wouldn't be so relevant and that we'd cover it and we'd cover this movement, but that somehow this movement lost steam. But in fact, the people that were in militias are now in suits in Washington, it would seem. I don't think that's actually too extreme of a thing to say, seeing some of the appointments.
No, I don't think it's too extreme either. I think that, this is a movement that I've been following for 16 years. Sarah's been following it even longer. It didn't start overnight, it long preceded Trump, but we're dealing with a real challenge to our political economy and to our information economy, to be honest. We really need to begin to address these dysfunctions in order to preserve our democracy and staunch some of the damage.
I really like the way that you wrote this book. I've loved your previous work, obviously, but Money Lies in God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. Rarely do I feel like a book is so well titled that when you talk to the author, you can be like, unpack each word of this and the subtitle, because you did write it in this, is it 3 or 4 3 sections? Money, Lies, and Demons is what the third section is called. But it's so well written. It's really compelling. You take us inside the movement. You meet the actual people. You've got some crazy tales to tell. So if it wasn't so serious, the consequences and the strength of the movement, it would be really entertaining to read this. That's what I find hard in reading it, is that I'm like, wow, I can't stop turning the page, reading the story, but oh no, oh dear, the power they've gotten. Talk about just how you wrote this book in terms of the actual investigative journalism. You went to all kinds of crazy right-wing conferences. You went right up into them, talked to everybody.
That's right. I've always felt like you can't really know what's happening in this movement unless you're in the room when they're talking amongst one another, rather than when they're just like on CNN as an invited guest talking to the general public. And, so I've gone to right-wing conferences, strategy gatherings at extremist churches. I've gone to some of the events of the large pastoral networks where movement leaders draw these pastors, conservative-leaning pastors, into networks and give them very sophisticated messaging tools and data tools for turning out their congregations to vote their so-called biblical values, which is always about, as one speaker said at the most recent Turning Point USA gathering, is called America Fest. I went in December. He said, there is absolutely no biblical justification for voting Democrat. It's hard to explain the degree to which the politics here leads the religion and not the other way around.
Yeah, I mean, but you go way more extreme. There's also no reason to allow women to vote, is a theory that a lot of these people hold. And I almost want everybody to have been asked that in their confirmation hearings. And, Trump has his litmus test. I think journalists should have that be the litmus test for anybody in power that they get to.
Do you think women have a right to vote? I know. Those kinds of voices used to be so extreme, you really didn't hear them at all. And now even like Pete Hegseth's pastor, he runs a large ministry, and Pete Hegseth has attended one of the sort of parachurches within that larger ministry. This guy, Doug Wilson, his profile is being elevated within the movement. He's actually making connections within the new right, which is, I talk in my book about how the Christian nationalism and the new right are like the power couple of the new American authoritarianism. Doug Wilson attends new right conferences like NatCon, and he said it was like a mistake to give women the right to vote.
Doug Wilson is a guy that, what's his name? He's been on the show a couple times, the NPR journalist Heath Dresner did a great series covering Doug Wilson. He's the guy in, is it Idaho?
Moscow, Idaho. That's right.
I had no idea who he was. Everybody should look him up. If you didn't hear us talk about him, you just heard Katherine mention him. Man, there's a lot of names in this book, and I almost just want to be like, when I interview Katherine, I'm just going to be like, tell me about this guy. Tell me about that guy. Because a lot of them you met, a lot of them you talked to, a lot of them you watched speak and got, you basically have interpreted their ideology for us in your book. And I think that's probably the most important thing that we learn. Here's what they're saying. Here's what they believe. And here's, most importantly, what they're doing and where the power lies. So let me just come back to another person that you met who has reinterpreted Christianity going back to like in the 1700s. Is it Miles? I've got names all over my notes
Miles.
here.
He's the head of Turning Point Faith. And
what's his name?
His name is Lucas Miles.
Yeah.
He's the head of Turning Point USA. Turning Point USA is Charlie Kirk's organization. Right. It plays a really important role in drawing younger people into the movement. He's, turning out the vote. And they've got a sort of faith outreach arm called Turning Point USA Faith. Lucas Miles is the head of it. And he was at America Fest and he was referring to woke Christianity. He's got a book titled something like Woke Jesus, the heresy infecting the American. I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the title in front of me, but he said, I've made it my mission to, eliminate, woke ideology from the American pulpit. And he referred to the social gospel as this sort of heretical progressivism that, and he said he also, by the way, bashed the historical Jesus movement, liberation theology, Black liberation theology. And he said, this sort of sin of progressivism started to influenced the American church in the 1700s. He wants to take American Christianity back to the 17th time when, slavery was widely practiced in those states that allowed it, and also that women had no right to vote and other rights. These kind of really extremist voices were once not allowed near the center of the Christian right. At the time, an earlier era, the Christian right just represented themselves as wanting, being concerned about certain values, wanting to protect the family. We're really concerned about, same-sex marriage and abortion and things like that. We just really want to have our voices heard in the larger forum of, a noisy form of American democracy. But that's no longer the case. And, the movement is also drawing new energy from communities of Pentecostal and neo-charismatic movements that are actually very easily given over to hard right politics. Those movements themselves can be very diverse politically and certainly ethnically, or multiracial and transnational movements, although there are a lot of differences. If you're looking at Pentecostalism, for instance, very broadly speaking, there is some Pentecostalism that is very progressive, but there's a sector of those movements that is very easily given over to hard right politics. They see spiritual battles in the heavenly realm playing out in the sort of political arena here and now. They say God's hand is on Donald Trump's shoulder, and anyone who goes against him is of the devil.
You say they a lot here, and I feel like maybe, and I'm not sure how closely, and if you've written about it here in the book, I don't think this is your focus, but when I say they, I'm thinking of a lot of Republicans in the United States House of Representatives and United States senators. And I don't think they're always overtly wearing it on their sleeve, but we know who they are. And some of them are. Some of them obviously say the most batshit crazy things, and they are Christian nationalists, and they proudly say, I am a Christian nationalist, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think I heard Senator Tommy Tuberville say it, and we've heard plenty of House members. So I just wanted to just get your quick take. When you're saying they, you're talking about a lot about in your book who you covered, and the activists and the funders and the lawyers. But just to be clear, they are in power now in the House, and I'm not even talking about state houses.
Yeah,
and Supreme Courts.
The movement really draws on a range of different actors and groups, many of whom, by the way, have incompatible goals. I think it's really important when we're talking about the movement to distinguish between the leaders and the followers of the movement, the foot soldiers, many of whom may not think of themselves as Christian nationalists. Some of them are, but with their actions, they're lending support to a Christian nationalist agenda. So in general, as you'll see in the book, I avoid calling specific individuals, unless, they self-identify as Christian nationalists, a Christian nationalist, or unless it's somebody like David Barton, who's one of the movement's key myth makers, who will say, America's founded as a Christian nation. As I define Christianity, our laws should be based on a reactionary interpretation of the Bible, and makes up history in order to conform to this idea.
And by the way, he was popularized, on Fox News by Glenn Beck back in the day. So it's not like all of these people have receded into the bushes. You cover them so well in this book, telling us where they are and exactly what they're doing. And I just think that their power is dispersed in so many different ways. At least that's what I'm getting from your journalism here. And I'm sorry to interrupt you talking about David Barton there, but he's
really
not
okay.
He's not new. This has been around for a while, but now they are so much more powerful, I think it's fair to say.
That's true. In Money, Lies, and God, I pay very close attention. I'd love to talk for a little bit about the different groups. I pay very close attention to the funders. This is a sector of beneficiaries of the massive concentrations of wealth over the past 5 decades. They're investing a portion of their fortune in anti-democratic projects. And by the way, religiously, they're all over the place. I'm thinking about people like the Corkerys or Barry Side or the DeVos Prince family juggernaut or the Wilkes brothers or Tim Dunn. So some of them are evangelical, some Protestant, some are Catholic, some are Jewish, some are frankly atheistic or nihilistic, don't seem to believe in anything more than money. But the one thing that they want is policies that are going to benefit their privilege. Their privileged wealth. They want often protective policies for their monopolistic practices, even as they say they just want capitalism. Some of them really want their tax subsidies because they get subsidies for their businesses.
Exactly. They don't want only policies they want policies that are in their way to be removed, policies that aren't there to be created, and most importantly, they want government money. They want subsidies. That's every company, every industry gets subsidized one way or another, and it's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but let's be clear, that's what they're asking for in this case.
That's right. And how did they get those policies? Through Christian nationalism, by spreading this sort of getting the little people to vote for sort of values.
Get into it, Katherine. Go ahead and trace any one of these funders and how they necessarily do that, because you profiled, I think it's probably my favorite part of the book, the money section, and the way you go deeply into who they are, who the players are, and how you organize them for us. And nobody's done it this well as you did in this book. So I think it's so much all there, but trace any one of them you want, how that works.
This is where the lies in my title fits in. There are these massive disinformation or propaganda campaigns that exist to inculcate fear in the American people, to make them think that they're being victimized by a woke elite or the deep state. They, are being led to believe that political opposition to Trump is literally demonic or satanic. I feature one of these engines of conspiracism, by the way, in my chapter on Reawaken America. You know what this is. It's a pro-MAGA conspiracy fest that takes place in mega churches around the country. And it's organized by Mike Flynn, and one of the Trump kids usually shows up to speak. And a lot of these, that and other sort of disinformation and propaganda campaigns are being funded often directly by some of these funders. Different funders will fund different pieces of that, and others fund, parts of the policy network or legal advocacy ecosphere. But this really leads us to the religious nationalism piece of it. So Christian nationalism is arguably the single most important piece of the anti-democratic reaction, because it motivates a lot of the voters or local activists, a group I refer to as the foot soldiers, very distinct from the leaders. So again, many of them might not identify as Christian nationalists, but with their actions, they're lending support to a Christian nationalist agenda. And I also show, that there are these sort of very political pastors, national activists, cohorts that I call the sergeants and power players. Yeah. And they're often the ones driving the agenda.
Yeah, a lot of these are your terms to help us, the reader, organize them. They don't refer to themselves as sergeants.
No, but I needed to find a way to figure out where each sector of the movement fits into the larger picture, because often they're operating, some of them have really different ideas about what they want. The rank and file want a better deal for the workforce and for themselves. A lot of them are feeling left behind. In the last few decades, we've had this massive increase of wealth at the tippy top of the economic pyramid, right? And it's people down, it comes at the expense of the rights of the workforce. Housing costs are really difficult. I could go on about how life is realistically harder for a lot of people in America. So they become resentful, and movement leaders are really good at tapping into those resentments, including, I would say, unexamined, sometimes racial resentments or resentments about or anxieties about gender order.
When you say unexamined, go unpack that.
Just give you an example. I'll give you one example from my travels, okay? I was at a Moms for Liberty breakfast, and I'm sitting next to this lady, and she was, what Moms for Liberty is.
Oh, I deal with them directly.
And they raise hell,
Yeah.
Yeah. And they accuse schools of being gender change factories, which they're not, and teaching CRT, which they don't. So I'm sitting next to this lady, and she tells me her story. She was, haphazard anti-abortion activist, but very, in a very mild way. She'd signed a couple of petitions. That was it. But the thing that really got her threw over the top is she found out through one of these sort of, public school propagandists that The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank, this book about the Holocaust, was in a public school library. And this was too much for her. And I was really surprised. I was like, what was it about that book that you objected to being in a public school library? And she said, the lesbian scene. And I was struggling to remember a lesbian scene in a Diary of Anne Frank. And you can't because it doesn't exist, right?
There isn't anything in there about her.
There isn't anything.
Even
but
remotely.
She had been the victim of this conspiracy. And look, if you talk to this woman a little longer, you might find some sort of unexamined, certainly homophobia, and also maybe some unexamined anti-Semitism. But that's not. It was this movement was able to tap into that and get her involved in Moms for Liberty through the amplification of disinformation. There's a tiny, a couple of lines in the book about these two, Anne and her friend, and they're pledging their friendship to each other, and there is no lesbian scene. But it's like a moment of these two friends. But somehow they're able to twist this. Who knows what goes, well, we know Moms for Liberty. We know about Bridget. Don't say three-way.
In my town, I got to tell you all about this off air. Might be a source for you. In my town, though, the Moms from Liberty chapter that started about 6 months ago started by a guy who's mad about trans kids. So he's a man calling himself a mom who's upset about kids who are transitioning, which it just doesn't get any richer than that. But unfortunately, they're very dangerous in my town, had a lot of issues with them and threats from them, which is happening all over the country.
What their real aim is to destroy public education as we know it, to foster mistrust in the public education system by spreading this, politics of outrage. And they're either by softening the ground for wholesale assault and diverting all of that lovely taxpayer money to private and religious schools that are free to, discriminate against kids they don't like and inculcate children in contempt for those who are different.
I like you use the phrase religious nationalism better than Christian nationalism, because the term toxic masculinity, I think it had its time, but then it gets into the cultural zeitgeist and people then decide how they feel. So I got in an argument with a MAGA guy the other day who was open-minded enough, and he didn't realize that Christian nationalism is theocracy. It's religious nationalism. And since the vast majority of religious Americans identify as Christian, we don't want to alienate those who aren't, quote, Christian nationalists or want any part of it or know about it. So I feel like the terminology matters, and I feel like religious nationalism is better. And I want your comment on that terminology and why it matters. But the bigger question was, how is Christian nationalism antithetical to democracy?
Thank you. There's a lot to unpack here. I use the term religious nationalism very deliberately in the subtitle of my last book because I wanted to make clear its similarities with other forms of religious nationalism around the world.
Right, that we might not like.
No, think about it. When you have a leader like Putin in Russia, or Orban in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, or leaders in Iran. Okay, so these are four very different places. There are nuances specific to those different places, but when these leaders want to consolidate more authoritarian forms of political power, they bind themselves very tightly to ultra-conservative religious leaders in their own country, these mullahs or these, clerics or pastors or whatever, in order to consolidate a more authoritarian form of political power. They're bubble wrapping themselves in sanctimony. They're saying, you can't touch me. I got the holy man to my right and the holy man to my left. And it's a guard, like a preventative against any investigations of the abuses they're perpetrating against their own people, their cronyism, the way they're actually stealing from the public treasury and allowing members of their inner circle to get rich on the public's behalf.
And that you're not referring to what's going on right now. You're referring to before Elon Musk came in with the keys of the treasury. That's not what you were referring to.
No, I'm just talking about the dynamic of religious nationalism, how it works around the world and throughout history. You can see examples in history with Salazar in Portugal. You can see with Mussolini who, by the way, himself was an atheist, but allied himself with regressive elements of the Catholic Church in order to consolidate more authoritarian forms of governance. So these countries can be described in a way as theocracies in a certain fake sense, in that there's an official religion.
Right.
It may be, depending on the region, their laws might be based more or less on certain holy texts, but they're more accurately described as cronyistic authoritarian kleptocracies with suppression of free speech and no tolerance for political opposition.
Which is exactly where we are headed, or partially in, one might argue. And what about the other part? Christian nationalism, why is it antithetical to democracy? Why can't, are they opposite? They can't coexist?
Christian nationalism is like a reactionary form of exclusionary form of nationalism. It's about who gets to properly belong in a country and who doesn't. And there's nothing more antithetical to, the idea of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, where no one is above the law. The elected officials are subject to the law. They're not kings. They can't just make policy. Laws should be subject to, a vote, held to a democratic vote, and not just, based on a kind of holy text that one, smaller segment of the population is able to impose on everybody else. For these reasons and others, religious nationalism is incompatible with democracy, certainly in the American sense. Now, you see, if you're looking at Europe, where some countries have a sort of vestige of a state church, but the church is moderate, you can see how within those contexts, it's much more, there's like more room made. But when you have a kind of religious nationalism that, America's founding is very different. We were a pluralistic country from the start.
Right.
We're a country, if you read our people like Thomas Jefferson and Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, religious nationalism is completely antithetical to what these and other key founders of what America is today were intending.
That's your interpretation, the interpretation of most historians. But I would argue, and as I think you have taught me to, that is not their interpretation. And I would add that I think we realize this, that they have educated or radicalized or re-educated a generation or more of Americans into believing something wildly different about our founding and our founders. And as you mentioned earlier, Jesus himself, Kristin Dumez writes about that. And so do so many others, as do you. But that's really what I feel like is such a key issue here, is that most Americans don't understand civics. They don't understand government. They certainly don't like it. They scapegoat it for everything, and they don't understand our history and our founding. So when I'm arguing with people my age in my town about the separation of church and state, and do you support it or not, they often start the argument with, that's not America. We don't have, that's not our, and then I don't know what to do.
Yeah, Houston, you have people like David Barton, who's, again, a key myth maker of the movement. Yeah. He's been discredited over and over by academic historians, including academic historians at conservative Christian colleges. In fact, his publisher, Thomas Nelson Publishing, took back his book, refused it. They were going to publish it, and then they revoked, the publishing agreement because they said it lacked matters of fact. It was the first time in the history of this conservative Christian publishing house that they had actually done that.
Wow. I didn't know that.
They said it was just so full of errors, not just, little technical errors, but like substantial errors, that they, stopped publishing it. But that hasn't stopped Barton. And he's like in my last book, I call him the Where's Waldo of the Christian nationalist movement, because he's everywhere. And now his son is taking on his mantle. So I saw his son, Tim Barton, speak at a Moms for Liberty conference. And I've seen him speak at pastor gatherings. I've seen him speak at an initiative called Faith Wins, which they hold in churches all around the country. And it's one of those pastoral networks where they're trying to turn out pastors to vote for the hard right candidates that the movement favors.
That's a really interesting initiative and network of people that alone deserves an hour of conversation, that pipeline, and that there's so much more to talk about. You talk about in the third section of your book, it's titled Demons, the rise of the spirit warriors. Who are they? How do I get to be one?
in the last year, so in recent years, the movement has drawn new energy from a sector of Pentecostal and neo-charismatic movements, which I think we spoke about this a little bit earlier. They see the politics in the here and now being an expression of spiritual battles. They've brought new energy into the movement because they brought new populations into the movement. These are, again, transnational movements. This sort of Pentecostal and neo-charismatic movements, for instance, are very popular and on the rise in the global South and in Latin America. And you're seeing a kind of almost like a technology transfer where some of the organizations coming from different Latin American countries are installing sort of chapters or organizations or outposts in the U.S. and vice versa. And in between 2016 and 2020, the Latino vote overall shifted 8 to 10 points in favor of Trump.
Right.
And then between 2020 and 2024, it shifted even further. And a lot of that is due to the fact that there's been a huge effort by movement leaders to bring these Pentecostal and neo-charismatic pastors into the fold. And you see it at places like, I've been trying to go every year to Ralph Reed's Faith and Freedom Coalition. He's got an annual conference called Road to Majority. And I remember the first time I saw a representative of kind of the New Apostolic Reformation, this guy named Lance Wallnau, and I was surprised to see him there. I was like, what's he doing here? This is maybe 2015 or something like that. And that was unusual because prior, you really wouldn't see that element, that sector of Christianity, within the mainstream of the Christian right? It was more like traditional denomination, Southern Baptist Convention, white evangelicals. And all of a sudden, Lance Wallnau is there. And over the years, I see the sort of that segment of the movement embraced more and more by this movement. I've spoken to a number of folks who are affiliated with those ministries, the pastors or the members of the rank and file. And they speak about how they've really been embraced by leaders of this movement.
Wow.
I think people like Ralph Reed are very astute. They know that their movement cannot stay all white because, white evangelicals overall. I remember he said once, pay no attention to the polls. Our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. And he was right. He was talking about turning out your base of voters, but he was also working at the time to bring in new populations that would, again, bring new energy to this movement. And one thing that's so interesting about that sector is they have modes of operation, a language and a style that is spilling over into other sectors of the movement, even those that are not themselves charismatic and Pentecostal.
That's important to measure and to watch and to see. You can see it bubbling up. And that's so much of what your journalism is like, connecting these dots and chasing these ideas and theories as they spread and where they spread. And, I guess I'd be remiss to not talk about a really important and sadly relevant chapter in your book, Smashing the Administrative State. That's what's happening right now as we speak. You write at the beginning of this chapter, my old friend, I don't know if you knew this, but I used to share a radio studio with Steve Bannon.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
He did 6 to 9 a.m. and I did on the Breitbart. He hosted the Breitbart show on the conservative channel at Sirius, and I did 9 to 12 on a channel called Insight, which is like comedy politics.
Honestly, so how many shirts did he wear at once?
I just remember
like a million shirts on. It seems very confusing.
He was such a slob in every way. I've got all kinds of stories and sad observations. But you write in this chapter, when Steve Bannon suggested in the weeks after President Trump's 2017 inauguration that the agenda of the new administration would center on the, quote, deconstruction of the administrative state, he was greeted with many quizzical expressions. Whatever is an administrative state, and how does one deconstruct it? But the term had long been in currency at places like the Federalist Society and the Claremont Institute. I also like your writing because it observes what I've experienced. I'd never heard that until I heard my old friend Steve Bannon say it. Take me to what's next. What did they mean? What did they know about it long before Bannon at the Claremont Institute?
Yeah, there's this group of intellectuals that I call the thinkers that I really focus on in several chapters of Money, Lies, and God. Many of them are affiliated with the New Right. That's the New Right. So technically the intellectuals on the New Right.
Do you want to name a few of them?
Oh, I mean, think about Russell Vogt, think about Michael Anton, think about Darren Beattie. You've got people,
this guy, would you include this guy, Curtis?
In Trump administration now.
Would you include that guy, Curtis Yarvin? He apparently is very influential on Peter Thiel, who created J.D. Vance in a lab.
Absolutely. He is very engaged with the Claremont Institute. The Claremont Institute is a think tank, came up in the late 1970s, coalesced around a political theorist who, was frankly very preoccupied with democracy and conservative in a sort of classic sense, but, very concerned about America's founding principles. And, in their early years, they really weren't crazy. They really were very sort of pro-democracy. I would say more from the conservative side, but over the years, it's like the wheels have fallen off. And now they normalize voices like Curtis Yarvin, who refers to people like the professional class, people who actually make things work and have expertise within government, as the cathedral in a sort of negative sense. So yeah, they're talking about smashing the administrative state. Some of them are, Russell Vogt are more Christian nationalist. He actually self-identifies as one, but others are more nihilistic. And some actually draw inspiration from political theorists associated with the Nazis, like Carl Schmitt. I'm serious about that.
Oh, yeah.
But they seem more driven by, campus politics or political conflicts than anything else. For them, it's really about power and, they criticize liberal elites. But what they really are aiming for is to become a new elite. They know that, by the way, a lot of them went to elite educational institutions, but they know that expertise is actually not helpful to an authoritarian leader. People like Yarvin say that liberalism no longer works anymore because we're facing a kind of crisis of a woke elite, taking over everything. And, and he sort of, a lot of them talk about, how they want an American Caesar, a king, and they say liberalism is so broke that we're going to get a king and it's either a red Caesar or a blue Caesar. Let's have a red Caesar, but they've also really played a crucial role. I think a lot of people don't understand is bringing the funders together with the foot soldiers of the Christian nationalist movement. I sometimes think of them as like billionaire whisperers. They tell the billionaires how to spend their money, which features of the movement, of the anti-democratic movement, that they should be funneling their wealth into in order to grow those different features.
We haven't talked about the legal efforts that have been well funded for a very long time. Now you've got this Alliance for Defending Freedom, or ADF, or whatever it's called. And obviously you've got the Federalist Society. So much of the movement strategy for a long time, very long time, has been in lawsuits, legal efforts, and so through the courts, but also appointing right-wing conservative Christian judges. And I think it's fair to say they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams at getting the most perfect judges they could imagine on the courts to do all of their bidding on the several issues across the culture war that they have been fighting for a long time. Say a word about the strategy there and what new we learn in your new book.
A lot of money buys a lot of law. The money flowing through the right-wing legal ecosphere is really tremendous. Think about Barry's side. So Leonard Leo, as you know, has served for a very long time as a kind of money man of the right-wing legal ecosphere. He, built up the Federalist Society really to where it is today. He also managed the money part of a range of other organizations, huge amounts of money flowing through this. So Barry's side, by the way, is a Jewish Chicago billionaire who donated $1.6 billion to form the Marble Freedom Trust. They can spend $230 million a year without touching the nut. And he put Leonard Leo in charge of it. It shows that like the funders, really their aims aren't religious. Some of them are more religious than others. I think, for instance, people like the Wilkes brothers are true believers in a way. But Barry's side, do you think he's really motivated by, the idea that America should be a Christian nation? It's really about trying to, build a kind of larger anti-democratic movement. And Leonard Leo years ago basically said that he knew the policies he wanted would never be passed if they were put to a vote.
They're not popular policies across any polling and any question. They're not popular. But when you gerrymander districts, when you pack the courts, when you
throw like hundreds of millions of dollars into your system to build up the right kinds of cases, to bring to the right courts, to put the right people in place. A lot of money creates a lot of law.
I always go to the issue of guns and gun violence on that, because the vast majority of Americans, like overwhelmingly, and I'm always defending that to foreigners, and people don't realize it's like the vast majority of us want all kinds of regulations put on guns, but it doesn't happen except at the state level where Democrats are in majorities. But at and that can be overturned by the Supreme Court as well. It's just one example of an unpopular policy. But that Christian nationalists and that movement is happy to leverage the gun people as well.
That's true. Here's the other thing. A lot of the policies, the funders don't just want, it's not the culture wars that seems to animate them the most. It's really policies that are going to increase their wealth, protect it. Here's the funny thing about a lot of them. I think a lot of them are actually motivated by anxiety. They have a lot of money. They don't need more money, really, do they? But they know that a certain, as they've become the beneficiaries of often unearned wealth, through their monopolistic practices, they hear criticisms. Like they live on these islands, right, where, they're very protected and surrounded immediately by people who are just going to say nice things to them. But they can hear from far off the voices of their critics saying, we're having trouble. We're a family. We got 4 jobs between 2 adults and we can't, take care of our kids properly. So because this is what's happening in America. A lot of people are really struggling to have dignity for their families. So they hear these criticisms and it makes them anxious. And, they embrace these policies that are going to justify their wealth.
I don't agree. I don't agree with, and I'm sure you would hear my point here, that these people, let's take Elon Musk, doesn't need more money. I think he does need. I think that when you say that, or when we think that, it means for himself, or he could, spend all of it. He could never spend it. He's the richest man, and you can't imagine how much money he has. I think, though, there's never enough money to buy countries, which is what he seems to be doing. He's buying countries so that he can get his products in those countries as much as he can. He's in Italy. He's in Germany. He's obviously inside the treasury right now. So I feel like you need billions of dollars to take over. And I feel like there's some of these theories professed. It's transnationalism. It's not American theocracy or American dominance. It's these tech bros, these companies, even the fossil fuel companies, you could argue, they want to exist as autonomously and unimpaired as possible in every country. They want to be able to sell their products to every country. And so that's why they need all of the money.
I also think there really is a negative feedback cycle where the more, like a lot of these folks are in exploitive industries, and the more exploitive they are, and the more extreme concentrations of wealth at the tippy top comes at the expense of people further down on the economic ladder, the more criticism they get, and the more criticism they get, the more defensive they become. And I think this point has been made about Mark Andreessen. What seems to motivate him is the feeling that he somehow feels disrespected. He thinks he helped create the modern world and should be patted on the back for it and rewarded with even more money. Instead, he's being criticized, and that makes him defensive. Now, obviously, we can't know what's in people's heads. We can't know for sure what motivates them. But, for them to take out, their whatever it is on democracy itself, to
their personal grievances on anything from being canceled to, I think, we're not supposed to do this, as you just said, but I'll analyze like Elon Musk. I think a lot of his grievance, because he said it over and over, is against what he refers to as something called the woke mind virus. And specifically because of his own kid came out as trans, and he's the kid of the son of Nazis. So I think that's important to mention as well. I mean, his ideology is really motivated by a lot of insidious views that are, I don't want to psychoanalyze. I just want to ask you what you think about Elon Musk's role in all of this. I feel like many of the players that you read about and covered in events didn't see this specific guy or scenario coming. They didn't see the richest man in the world getting on board with their movement, buying the presidency basically, then going in and deconstructing the administrative state with a few 19-year-olds. I don't think they saw that coming. I think they're pleasantly surprised by it. But what are your thoughts, and what is his role in the movement?
Yeah, I think a lot of people didn't see that billionaire co-pilot coming. But it's just an example of the ways in which they're completely comfortable smashing our democracy and its institutions. It's really ironic that this is a movement that has for so long wrapped itself in red, white, and blue and claimed that they're, just really care about the founders, but they show nothing but contempt for our democracy and its institutions. Authoritarianism, or I would say, to be less polite, fascism, I think it's better understood as something that happens to a political system rather than something that actually starts off as a full-fledged political program that receives majority support. There are different pieces of this movement. The billionaires, you've got the Christian nationalist folks, you've got the thinkers. They're all rowing in the same boat in a sense. But I think the outcome of their collective actions can be really unpredictable. And many of the rank and file who voted for Trump, for sure, don't anticipate the consequences, like the, billionaire, richest man in the world and his 19-year-old kids marauding through the government, taking aim at grandma's Social Security check. Like, they're not going to be okay with that. I think that, as we start to see the consequences of this activity, as people lose their jobs, as the price of goods and services gets higher due to these needless tariffs, as, the Republicans recently, I believe they just raised the debt ceiling, some huge amount, was something they said that they would never do.
Yep. Yesterday, they proposed their budget, $4 trillion. I think it would add. They've never actually been
$5 trillion.
serious.
It's like a huge amount of money. And they said that they wouldn't do that, as they don't get the better deal for themselves and for the workforce, as they see, billionaires like Musk's just taking advantage of the situation. There is a real opportunity to tell them this is what they're doing. It's not in your interests, and they're responsible for it. And I think that's really important. There are fissures within the movement. I don't think, for instance, a lot of the billionaires are motivated by sort of Christian nationalist goals, but they will just see it as the price of doing business, right? It's a way to get the rank and file involved, and who cares, about some people's rights and things like that. And, who cares what happens to public schools, because we don't send our kids to public schools anyway. But I think the fissure between the agenda of the funders and the actions of the funders, or the actions of their money, and then the agendas of the rank and file, is really a place where there is an opportunity to do some pretty good messaging around those issues, drive a wedge.
That was always true, right? Since 1980, the Republican Party leveraged the right-wing Christian movement or evangelical Americans and it's only gotten, as you so well covered, more and more insidious, or the creep, more and more popular, one might argue, more and more influential within the Republican Party. They used to be the activists, now they're the electeds.
Yeah, absolutely. But, in an earlier time, I think the stakes were they would just listen, as long as the leaders can just get the rank and file to be outraged about abortion or same-sex marriage, or now like trans issues, which seems to be the primary culture war issue of the moment. Whatever you think of those issues, okay, or the specific policy here and there, we have to recognize that they're mobilizing the politics of outrage in order to draw people to their side. In many instances, they're, vastly overstating the nature of whatever it is that they're criticizing. So I think there was a head of the NCAA was recently asked, I think that, represents something like 500,000 athletes. He was asked, how many trans athletes are there? He said there are 10 self-identified. I'm not saying that whatever you think of those policies, this is like 11.4 million kids live in poverty. Gun violence is the number one cause of death among children and teenagers in this country. We have real problems in our country, and we should be, frankly, a lot more focused on those instead of distracted by these shiny baubles.
I made a speech at the Board of Education calling this for exactly what it was, and they were divided over two kids who identified as trans. That was all that mattered. But what they really wanted, obviously, is to get books out of the library, to affect curriculum. As you mentioned all of this earlier, because as we all knew, and as I said in my comments that day, and as I said over and over, the trans kid is a danger to himself, not to your kids. And my daughters are far more worried about that kid's well-being than their own. But they use it, and they won. They won in my town. They got 3 people elected on that. The way forward is the conclusion of your book, and that's why I want to wrap up our interview, because people should buy Money, Lies, and God just to read the conclusion, because you have a lot of good ideas in there. What do you want to say at the end?
Oh, so much to say. We should do a whole other show just about that.
I'll do it.
Let's do it.
Yeah,
we'll
done.
schedule it. That would be really marvelous. I outline about, 6 major points and get into each of them. And I don't have time to go into them now, but I will say now is not the time for us to, get into bed and pull up the covers. Now is a time for moral courage. We have to remember that there are more Americans who support a democracy than those who would wish to live in an authoritarian autocracy with theocratic features. We really need to, get engaged in democracy building organizations. There are things we can do as individuals, and there are things we can really do best when we join together with others. There are no shortages of avenues for engagement.
I'd love to have you come by and see what we do every Monday and Thursday night. We get anywhere from 50 to 80 people all over the country, and we just hang out, and I just host, and we talk and panic and laugh and cry.
It's great. Let's do it.
Yeah, definitely. And I should say, I feel bad now. You say we shouldn't pull up the covers. I read your whole book, Money, Lies, and God, under the covers by a candle, which I don't suggest anybody do. Thank you so much, Katherine. Congratulations. We'll schedule more time soon and get even more into the things we didn't talk about, because it's most of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, there she goes, Katherine Stewart. And when I get done reading the book, I'm going to read the whole thing, and I'm going to have her back. I think it's just such an important subject matter, and I hope that you liked it and appreciated it. I'm sorry I didn't get to the normal headlines and clips. We'll get back after that starting Monday, and I'll be dropping a couple of conversations over the weekend, I think, as well. So I hope that you'll tune in if you see the email come in, if you're a paid subscriber. And if you're not, patreon.com/Pete Dominick. Please join now so we can keep this going. I got to plug it every day. I've got to try to get new folks listening all the time just to keep this little train and community running. So I appreciate whatever you can pay. Patreon.com/Pete Dominick. That is it. That is all. Go get Katherine's book. Go support her on social media, and definitely let her know that you heard her here on the show. Go to Blue Sky, where she lives now, the main social media platform she and myself are on. Go check her out and say thank you for joining Pete. Okay, that's it. I'll talk to you tomorrow. JohnCarroll.org. Everybody go buy John's music and support independent artists everywhere. Okay, that's it. Bye-bye. Love you. Listen to The Right Wolf today.
Off of your fence, even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense, and you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town, just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up, and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says